Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered, and contribute to the community forum. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our construction, tech, or weekly Global Passive House Showcase webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. Great to be with you again. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh in a sort of wet, windy and cold Auckland.
And I'm Zack Semke in a idyllic Seattle, Washington today. We've actually had a very wet and cold spring and beginning of summer. I think a couple of days ago, it was the coldest day in July for the last 56 years.
Wow.
So it's been unseasonably chilly, but we're, a year anniversary away from that heat domes. I think I mentioned last episode probably. So it's great. It's actually great to be cold and a little wet, but today is gorgeous. It's
well, and I know there have been some pretty severe heat waves. I had some pretty severe hot weather across Europe as well as North America. And I should also acknowledge, when I say it's wet and windy here, my rain gauge is up around 40, 50 mils, but that's very minimal disruption to my life compared with some of the people that are experiencing flooding again in Sydney and up the east coast of Australia. So pretty significant weather events more than once this year that we're witnessing in this part of the world.
Yeah, those images from Sydney have been pretty sobering, and it seems to be happening really often now.
I wonder why that could be.
I don't know.
Well, let's get into this week's episode. Great interview. More content from your recent trip around looking at some cool buildings around the place.
Yeah, definitely. Bev Craig, who is a mover and shaker at Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, or MassEC. She also played the role of host at Passive House Accelerator Live for several months recently. Bev toured me around, I guess. She set up a bunch of tours of Passive House projects that are happening in Massachusetts when I was back there last week. And so this interview with Julie Klump happened at one of those projects, one of this really cool Passive House retrofit that's going underway by Preservation of Affordable Housing, or POAH.
Very cool. It's so cool to hear about all these great deep retrofit projects happening at scale as well. So we'll get into that. But before we do, we've got some people to thank.
We do, yeah. So our founding sponsors are 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingwe Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minutair All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification Units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwell North America, and Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Our champion sponsors are Icon Windows and Doors and Proseco, and our stakeholder partner is NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So a big thank you to our sponsors.
Awesome. And a couple of those sponsors get a mention during this episode.
Indeed. Indeed.
Well, you do a bit of an introduction on the ground in the building that you're looking at, and you do mention that there might be a bit of construction noise in the background, which is cool. Adds a bit of ambience to the interview because you were there having a tour. So let's jump into your chat with Julie Klump.
Sounds good. Welcome, Julie Klump. You are the VP of Design and Building Performance at POAH, which stands for Preservation of Affordable Housing, and a very frequent participant and thought leader on the Passive House Accelerator programs as well. It's really great to have you here for the Passive House podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So can you start by telling a little bit about your story about how you got involved with POAH and maybe your first introduction to Passive House?
Sure. I started at POAH over 12 years ago. They wanted a architect builder that could translate for them. They're all real estate developers, so they're sort of financially minded. So they created the role, and it was a good fit, and it was good timing for me. So we've tried to do as energy efficient as we can afford to do. We fund our projects with low-income housing tax credits, construction loans, grants for energy efficiency. There's funds for resident services. So big capital stack for every project that we do. Salem Heights, we bought over 15 years ago. When you get low income tax credits, there's a 15-year affordability contract that preserves the affordability. So when this project affordability contract was up, it was for sale and would have likely gone to market rate or be torn down. So POAH entered into a sale agreement to purchase the building. It wasn't inexpensive, so we didn't get to do a lot of acquisition rehab like we usually do. But we've maintained the building, and the 15-year contract is up, so we've engaged a new contract, new tax credits, and have really sunk a lot of money into this. We didn't expect to do as deep energy retrofit as we are doing. The brick, it's built in 1974. It's a concrete and steel building that has light gauge metal. That the steel, concrete, and light gauge metal was supposedly holding the brick on the building. In 1974, the code allowed for brick to be supported from the ground up without a shelf angle. So when we opened it up, most of the masonry ties were gone, and the steel detail that connected the brick back to the steel was like a tab, and most of the tabs weren't connected. So we realized that all the cracking that we had been seeing was due to the fact that the brick was likely not very secure.
Scary.
So, yeah.
That's very scary.
So the structural engineer said, there's no detail to reattach this brick. So the brick has to come off.
Right.
So,
there's
yay.
An opportunity.
Yeah. Yay for me, right? Because then I get to do a deep energy retrofit. And awesome. We had been introduced to Armor Wall, which is a structural insulated panel on some other projects, but this was like the perfect candidate for that. So we had our light gauge metal studs that were existing. We had those tested for gauge, for spacing, for condition. And surprisingly, with as bad a shape as the brick anchors were, the studs were in really good condition. And they were of the right gauge. The structural engineer was fine for us to attach Armor Wall and then attach an aluminum clad panel. So the Armor Wall is a structural insulated panel. You can get different R values. We went for the highest they had, which is an R21, attached to the stud. And the beauty of the structural panel in that is that then we could attach our aluminum panels to that structural sheathing, so we had no thermal bridges back to the structure. We chose aluminum panels because of durability and access to the side of this two 10-story towers. We didn't want to have to maintain painted materials or other materials. We're close to the ocean. It's windy up here, so that was our choice on the aluminum panels.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And I should say to listeners that we're sitting here in the first floor of the project as it's being retrofitted. So there's some noises that listeners will hear, and that's because work is underway right now. And you're doing this work with the residents in place, correct?
Yes.
So how are you orchestrating that? How's that working?
So we engaged a consultant, Housing to Home, and they're officed here, and they have helped us with relocation of residents. We're not relocating anybody off-site. Mm-hmm. We are creating 2 hotel suites on each floor. So there's 2 stacks, and those will be maintained as hotel suites, and residents on the floor in the 2 units we're working in will move into those units. And then when their units are done, they'll move back to new units. We'll move into there while we do the work in their units. We decided that we wanted residents out of units because, number one, the sheetrock compound is extremely hot. Ceilings, walls, everywhere in the building. So we had to do a lot of abatement in order to install new windows, install the softening for the Minitaire, install the closet for the Minitaire, as well as just concerns about COVID. So it made sense. And this was, there was a learning curve. It's extremely disruptive for anybody to go through this.
Sure.
But we hope that they're going to be glad we did it in the end.
And you mentioned the Minitaire. I know that the existing HVAC system, central HVAC system, the existing condition was very challenging, right? So can you tell us a little bit about the story of how you navigated that and what the solution was?
Yeah, similar to the fact that the brick would not stay on the building, which gave us an opportunity to overclad and do a deep energy retrofit on the enclosure. There's a giant steel beam that runs in the corridor above one side, above the door to the underside of the slab. So we looked at the current system is a rooftop unit that didn't provide any cooling, but provided tempered air that dumped into the plenums above all the units on each floor. And then there was a small, 6x6 register above the door that we measured years ago. And in most cases, there was no air flowing through that register. So system, I'm sure it's been off for years just because it doesn't work and it costs a lot of money to run. So we looked at using some of the vertical stacks to provide air into the corridor and then run down the corridor and into each unit on opposite sides of the hallway. Because of the steel beam, we realized that was not going to work. That would also have required us to install a cooling system, which would have been a little easier. We could have run refrigerant a lot easier than we could have run ducted air. So we looked at the Minitaire, and it's heating, cooling, ventilation in a box, and it sort of answered all of our, needs at the time. It takes up a little bit of room because we had to build a closet, but the air quality is amazing. It's pretty as complicated as it seems. I think it's a pretty simple unit. There are filters that have to be changed during the year. There's a tenant setting on the controller so that we can limit the confusion and just have residents adjust temperature in their unit. So that's sort of where we landed with heating and cooling. We still have we have a relatively new fossil fuel boiler system that makes hot water and heat. So we left the radiators in that provide heat. They'll be connected to the Minitaire so that they'll never be competing. And if the Minitaire is accommodating the heating needs, the radiator won't come on or the valve won't open. So, but we just were not sure about the Minitaire keeping up with that heating load. So we wanted to leave the heating system in for a couple seasons until we knew that it was working.
So there's a possibility that this all electric solution for HVAC that's basically unit by unit, right? There's one Minitaire per unit could render the centralized gas system hopefully obsolete, right? If things go well.
Yeah. Yep. In a couple of years, we should know if the Minitaire, and we've done enough to the enclosure that the Minitaire can keep up with the heating loads. The air conditioning system was through wall ACs. We've been able to get rid of the majority of those. There's a couple elevations, floors that the engineer was a little concerned about, so we left AC sleeves there, and we'll provide air conditioning to make sure that the Minitaire can keep up with the cooling in those units. And if the baseboard is not needed, then obviously we can take that system down. There's actually a cogen system here that's also burning gas to create electricity that we're decommissioning to eliminate that fossil fuel use, and installing 100 kW vertical array on one of the towers.
Right.
That instead of the metal panel, we just are attaching PV panels, and then we'll have 2 roof-mounted arrays that will cover both of these buildings. But it won't quite get us to zero, but I think it's just under half the electric load. But we won't really know until we sort of operate these units. POAH pays for all the utilities here, so we can keep up with all the data and use and anomalies through our data tracking.
Yeah, excellent. And the impact on the exterior of the building by the Minitaire is very small, right? Because there's no external unit that the Minitaire requires.
Right.
Could you explain how you're dealing with the intake and the outtake?
Sure. On the first floor, they're side by side. They're on either side of the window. But as you go up the building, we were able to exhaust low and supply, pull in air high on each floor. And so when you're outside looking at the building, you'll see louver openings high and low up the building. And so we staggered exhaust and supply for one unit, and then we switched it to exhaust and supply. So there's even more space between each than we really need. But that's how we're satisfying that, and it's along the closets from the inside.
So let's contextualize this a little bit in POAH's larger portfolio, because POAH, you're doing work all over the place, right? In the U.S. I mean, where's the scope? Yeah.
So we're in 11 states and D.C.
Yeah.
As far west as Missouri, but not any further west than that. But Ohio, Florida, D.C., lots in Chicago. We have a big portfolio there. So Massachusetts, because of the incentives in Massachusetts, we are able to, and QAP points, which help you get the low-income tax credits. There's a lot of impetus to try Passive House at least. And we feel like with the incentives, we're able to sort of do it. If we hadn't had those incentives, I don't know if I would have been able to convince people that it was a risk worth taking.
Yeah.
But we received 2 grants from Mass CEC for 2 of our Passive House projects in Boston. And so now any new construction we do in Boston, and by the year 2025, all of our new construction will be Passive House.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And are you the Passive House person?
Yes.
Kind of at POAH? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we have a Passive House project that should start construction later this summer in Chicago. We have a huge redevelopment in DC called Berry Farm that will be over 900 units, townhomes and multifamily buildings that we're committed to doing all Passive House. We're even building a net zero construction trailer there with some high school kids just to see if we can do it. And then in Boston, in the Cape, we have 3 projects in design, and one that's just wrapping up. Our first Passive House project in Boston will be leased up in August. So we'll really get to see the benefits. But, you know, we did a lot of pricing exercises because we wanted to know incremental cost. Mass CEC wanted to look at incremental cost, and we just had a really good GC on our first Passive House, and they knew what, they sent people to training, and they were really committed, and it seemed like it went. The issues might have been with a product, not with any installation.
Mm-hmm.
So they made it seem really easy. So hopefully the rest of them will go that well. And then I feel like then it's easy to go into another market like DC or Chicago and say, this can be done.
Right.
There's no premium. There's a little bit of learning curve. I don't think Passive House necessarily has to cost more money, but it does take more time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people that have to learn how to detail a building, how to engineer a system for a building, how to build those buildings. And there's a lot of demystifying that we have to do with all those people.
Your sense right now is no premium. It can be no cost premium for you in your work.
Yeah, I think windows, and we have our own basis of design, which has a pretty high standard.
Yeah.
It's higher. It's better than code in Boston.
Sure. Stretch
code. It's likely way better than Chicago or DC. So above that, it's really not. And I think the codes are catching up as long as, that's the codes continue to, require higher performance. Then Passive House is just, it's the best certification to me because it's pass fail. It's almost like I can say do Passive House and I don't have to think about it because it just has to happen. And then I think people are adopting it in terms of design and building. And so I just think it's the way to build.
Yeah. And so with the 11 states in DC, are you seeing then Passive House in POAH's practice? Like, is it starting to make inroads in all those states? So
in Chicago, we do very little new construction.
Mm-hmm.
So this will be a new construction Passive House. Most of the stuff in Chicago is historic. Well, part of the building is historic, usually the front facade of a masonry building.
Got it.
There's still quite a bit of pushback there for overcladding, even on the sides of a building that might have really, bad performing brick, spalled brick, open joints, that would really be served well by overcladding. So hopefully the work that we're doing at Salem and then we're going to do at the Fairweather projects in terms of a pre-manufactured panel that we can install on those existing buildings will help us with all the rehabs. Chicago has some interesting ventilation code rates that we've had to work around, but we have a clever consultant, so we've been able to get FIAS on board to how to test it and get the city on board to how we want to build it.
And how far south are you? Does POAH get?
So we have buildings in Miami.
Yeah. Okay.
In Florida, they're a long way off. They could power the whole country with solar, and they don't incentivize a light bulb. So So it's a struggle there, but at least we don't have to have super high performing windows there. Maybe a good solar heat gain, but coefficient, but they don't have to be super low U value.
Well, it's an inspiring story and really important work. Sitting in Seattle, where we're still just, you can count how many multifamily passive houses are built on one hand. It's really inspiring to be in Massachusetts to see what's going on here. So thank you for helping to make it happen. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, but I just want to thank the Passive House Accelerator. It was the highlight of my week during COVID. And I learned a lot, and I think it's done a lot for Passive House.
Well, thanks for everything that you've contributed there. So I appreciate it.
Sure.
And that was Julie Klump, and your catch up with her. For those, just as a reminder, for those that aren't familiar with that area, give us a quick rundown on the climate and the space, the environment that you're in there.
Yeah, well, this is a big affordable housing project from decades ago, and so it's clad in this failing brick facade. And it's in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, is very close to the water, and it's cold during the winter, very cold and very windy during the winter, and then gets fairly warm and humid in the summer. So there's a pretty wide swing, but it's, the kind of thermal envelopes and air tightness, all the strategies that underpin Passive House are really well suited for this climate. So when there's an opportunity to make a major intervention in the envelope, as there was because of the envelope's, kind of scary, about to fall apart nature when they acquired the building, there's a real opportunity then to make a major difference. And you couple that with the incentives that are in place in Massachusetts, thanks in no small part to the work of Beverly Craig, who I mentioned in the intro. And Mass CEC and Mass Save and all sorts of public policy that's been going on, then you have a real opportunity to see Passive House flourish, and that's what we're seeing in Massachusetts.
Yeah, that the brick ties basically not being there. For someone who has lived through a couple of decent earthquakes, that image is quite scary, of having a large building like that with bricks just kind of balancing up the facade.
Yeah.
So it kind of makes you wonder, 50 years, I think, is a reasonable life expectations, what we have as a design life for the structural elements in our building code here. But I think the underlying assumption is that buildings will last longer than that. And indeed, a lot of our buildings are 90 or 75, 90 and 90 plus years old. And people, I think, just assume that if a building is made of solid material, it's gonna stay there until it gets taken down and made space for something else. But there are systems that aren't necessarily lasting that long, and they can be invisible, which includes things like metal ties that are holding bricks to the outside of the wall. So a little bit scary, but great that it's being resolved, and beyond that, the opportunities being taken to dramatically improve the performance. We've had a bunch of stories recently, and it's great to have this increasing activity of retrofitting existing buildings to a passive house or near passive house standard, because it's not an easy thing to do. But as we have more projects like this, it's great to see suppliers come on board to make it easier and achievable to do.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, I think you heard Minutair feature pretty prominently in the conversation, and it's, I think that they're finding lots of success in projects like this where you can do, because it provides this unit by unit solution. There's not a compressor required on the outside of the building, so it's fair. You need to find space for the units inside, but it's fairly straightforward, and it addresses ventilation and heating and air conditioning and dehumidification in one fell swoop. So that really, I think, came in handy for Julie and her team on this one.
I think the particularly for me, I'm getting very interested in ventilation at the moment because it's an issue that we're grappling with here for a bunch of reasons. But I think that's really worth pointing out, that that's a big part of Passive House, because it's a big part of making buildings healthy and comfortable, is that continuous supply of fresh air, which in some ways is harder to do than just wrapping an existing building in a decent layer of insulation. That has some challenges, but it's relatively simple. You just need to add some external insulation and then protect that from the weather. But adding adequate ventilation to a building that doesn't have it can be really, really hard. If you haven't got existing ducting in place, or there's not cavities where you can run ducting and then get air into the whole of the building and into the center of the building, it can be very challenging to retrofit a supply of fresh air, which you need. It's a absolute requirement for producing a healthy, comfortable internal environment.
Indeed. And especially when you're doing these retrofits where you're having the tenants stay in the building during the process. So, you can't just rip out a system, a centralized system and install a new one. And when tenants are in place. So, we're hearing different approaches. So there was this approach that we just heard with this interview, and then the interview with Chris Benedict and Zach Veras with the StokeCorp episode, where Chris was using the kind of plasticity of the EFIS system on the exterior to integrate mechanicals, was, I thought, really interesting. So that's another approach. So there are many ways that I think people are getting creative. Practitioners are getting creative in addressing this problem. And it's definitely a hurdle, but critical to success with retrofits at scale, because it's really tough to remove an entire population from a building and then bring them back. That's not. It's a bit like
doing roadworks. You can't close down a whole city just because you want to resurface a road. You got to allow traffic or the use of that infrastructure at the same time as you're trying to upgrade it. I quite like that approach. It seems very empathetic to the people, where you shift them to another part, possibly in the same level.
Right.
But it hadn't struck me until listening to this, possibly my naivety of not embarking on a project of this scale. But I can imagine there's a lot of value in people staying in their location as the physical location, in their neighborhood, in that building. And it's a relatively minor inconvenience to move into a different apartment for a few weeks. But that's significantly better than having to move out to an entirely different place and have to learn a whole new part of the city, or just major disruption. So I think that's quite a good way of respecting the lives of people that are continue on living in the building, while you're trying to work around them and provide a better place for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that you mentioned that I think is so right is how important ventilation is to healthy buildings, and obviously because of COVID, we have a whole new appreciation for that, whether the building is Passive House or not. It also reminds me of the observation that Bev Craig has had about the cost differential between passive house and code building in Massachusetts. And what they are seeing is in the multifamily space, it's a cost premium of about 2% for passive house.
Right.
And the difference is actually you can peg that to fresh air ventilation. And who doesn't want to spend 2% more on a building to have good air today? So I think that ventilation and fresh air is kind of sells the idea of the package of passive house more and more now.
I was at an event by our Kind Order, who's our social housing provider here in New Zealand, and they're working on what will become Australasia's first publicly, what is it? I can't remember the exact terminology. It's passive house, social housing, affordable housing, kind of at a reasonable scale.
Nice.
Pretty exciting project, but Jason Quinn, who was there and has worked on the project, as have a lot of people, said that these will be probably some of the cheapest houses that Kind Order will own and operate over their lifetime.
Yes.
Which is such a great way of stating or diffusing the upfront cost question or concern, because yes, there is an uplift if you start comparing price per square meter of build price. But when you step back and say, well, this is a social housing provider retains most of their assets, they look after them over the life, and then they also have there's another government department that has the responsibility of actually housing the people in it. For New Zealand as a country, these houses that they're building, by virtue of being passive house, will be some of their most valuable and cheapest to run assets that they have. Yeah, and they'll also be a lot healthier and probably create much better places for tenants as well. So yes, there is going to be an uplift if you're raising the standard, but the long-term benefits of that down the track are going to be significant and probably cost a lot less in the long run.
Reflecting back to the Winthrop Center project that we addressed in the podcast episode last week, that's another example of a building that will be cheaper to operate than an existing building because of policy. So there are many reasons that it was a really smart decision for them to commit to passive house and the WELL standard, several years ago before COVID hit. One of them is attracting tenants now in an environment where people are leery of the office, and so they'll knowing that they're going to a safe environment could be powerful. But the other one is the policy moves that are happening around climate and buildings in Boston. And they have something called BERDO 2.0. It's BERDO. And it has to do with building energy reduction and disclosure, I think is what it is. But basically, it's committing all buildings that are 20,000 square feet or larger. But it was 20,000, not 25,000. But, medium sized to really big buildings, committing them to getting to zero carbon operational emissions by 2050, and pegging pretty hefty fines if they don't do that over kind of a stepped approach over the coming decades. So that upfront cost that passive house entails for that office building is going to save MP Boston and the building owner in the long run, because they're set. They're basically like pretty much dialed in for the next few decades. When you combine the operational efficiency of the building with renewable energy sources, and I think there's going to probably be some retrofit stuff that has to happen with gas boilers. But I think they planned ahead for that. So there are many ways that this, when you think of it, it's not just upfront, but it's what's the long term view that passive Passive House just really pencils. It's just like, are the incentives, do the incentives align? You got the split incentive problem sometimes, but in both of these cases, they really do align.
Yeah. Good stuff. Like I said, it's awesome to see these projects happening at scale and deep retrofit projects, because it's such an important part of fixing all the existing buildings out there and improving lives for people who are relying on those buildings and future tenants of those buildings. So great stuff. Great to see some of our supporters being part of that process as well, and providing excellent products and materials and expertise to enable this type of work to happen. So great stuff. We've got some events coming up.
We do. So we'll there are events in the community that we'll link to in show notes. And this coming week at the Passive House Accelerator, we have a construction tech edition of Passive House Accelerator live on Wednesday. So that's Thursday your time. And it's called Breaking the Norm, Influencing the Design Process and Emerging Markets for Passive House. And I'm really looking forward to this one. This is 2 speakers from Positive Energy, which is a really impactful Passive House consulting firm in Austin. And so it'll feature Kate Bren and Miguel Walker, 2 great speakers and thinkers in the space. So please join us on Wednesday/Thursday.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that, Zach. I'm pleased that you had such a great trip and was able to visit some really great projects and bring us those. Are you going to post some photos from
Yeah, absolutely. Well? I took a bunch of video, so I can post some stills from that for sure.
Yeah, or chuck the video up somewhere so we can speak in it.
Yeah. Well, I'm working on editing together a little video story.
Nice.
So yeah.
Very good. All right. Well, have a great week.
Likewise.
We'll be back again next week on the Passive House podcast.